Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? It's a question that voters commonly hear in an election year, and we're going to apply that question to the economic and financial prospects of American families.
For me, as an economist, I would normally look at those sentiment numbers and say, we're going over the cliff, right? Normally, that really tells us something. And for me, I got to the point where I'm like, I don't know what to do with this.
On this episode, we talk with Claudia Sahm. She's a former economist with the White House and Federal Reserve about the economic health of the country today. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and it's time for another installment of our Defending Enterprise feature segment with our regular contributor, Beth Akers, who's also a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Beth, thanks so much for joining us again on Defending Ideas.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's election year now, and one of the questions folks will often hear, voters will hear, is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Reagan used it, other candidates have used it. You had a really great discussion with somebody that we're going to get into today about that question, but applying it to the economic context of, are Americans better or worse off now, economically speaking, than they were, in this case, before COVID?
Right.
So tee it up for us. What do we need to understand about the conversation today to help answer that question in economic terms?
Well, what we're talking about is something that's very unusual, that's happening today, and that's never happened before in recorded economic history. And that is that the economic data suggests that people, broadly speaking, are in a great place today or in a better place than they were 4 years ago. But if you ask them how they feel, they're complaining, suggesting that their conditions are something like back in the 70s or the 80s. And so there's this really sort of weird dissonance. And it's definitely something that candidates on both sides of the aisle are going to be playing with, I would imagine, as they approach, the elections in November and are thinking about how people feel about how the last 4 years have been for them.
So what we want to do for the listeners for this episode is equip them with a really good understanding of what's actually going on and the economic data and the consumer sentiment data. And you spoke with somebody who's a well-known national expert to help flesh this out. Talk about the guest you spoke to.
Right. So like anything, the discipline of economics has people who fall towards the right and people who fall towards the left. So my guest was Claudia Sahm, and she is somebody who's generally representing ideas in economics that fall towards the left. So we often disagree, but I very much respect the way that she engages in debate. And she fell into an interesting exchange on Twitter, of all places, recently, where she basically made these claims that the economy is in a better place than it was 4 years ago, and people are better off than they were 4 years ago. Now, she got a lot of flack about this. People on the right were mad at her, people on the left were mad at her, but I appreciated that she was just sharing economic data. And so I thought it was a great opportunity to talk to her about, what is actually happening? What does the data tell us? And what can we infer about the fact that we have this deviation from how people feel from what we're actually measuring is happening in the economy?
Well, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll dive right into your conversation with Claudia Sahm. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Beth Akers, here with your segment on Defending Enterprise. I'm very pleased to welcome a guest we have today named Claudia Sahm. She is a prominent voice in macroeconomics, one that I don't always agree with, but one that I always respect. And very much excited to talk to her today about an issue that's been really dividing, I think, the discourse on economics over the past several weeks. So welcome, Claudia.
Thank you. I so much appreciate to be here. And the compliment is likewise to you. So.
Thank you. Well, so Claudia, it was a few weeks back now when I saw that you sort of became the target of some pretty angry people on Twitter, which is not an unusual experience for you, I will say. But this one caught my eye as particularly interesting. And it seemed that the dissonance or the issue was over the dissonance between what economic data was teaching us in the moment relative to what people seemed to be feeling. So can you just start us off by talking about basically where are we today in terms of what does the data tell us about the strength of the economy, and especially relative to where we were at the start of the COVID pandemic? Because I think that's the comparison that got you in some particular hot water.
Right. So if we start big picture, think about the economy as a whole, the labor market, the unemployment rate, consumer spending, inflation adjusted. So the kind of quote unquote macro data. We are in such a better place than we thought. This time last year, things were really scary. Inflation had gone up a lot. The Fed had gone big on interest rates. It really looked like we were headed towards a recession in 2023. Well, we're going into 2024, and that is no longer the consensus. We really held up. So that's amazing. So just even thinking about within 1 year, the progress we've made. And if you think back to before COVID, we, on many dimensions, have a full recovery. I mean, we all want to forget the spring of 2020. That was horrible when the pandemic began. And we had the most severe, the fastest recession since the Great Depression. We had millions of people losing jobs like every week. So we've got that back. Now, there were disruptions. I mean, we shut a $20 trillion plus economy down. It turns out starting to back up has been painful. And so it came with inflation. And then Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, we had other factors, right? So there's a lot going on under the hood. We don't have the quote unquote soft landing yet. So that's when inflation is back down. The Fed wants to see it at 2%, but, just lower than it was in the summer of 2022. And unemployment is low. We have, and we learned this just recently with December, we left 2023 with the longest stretch of unemployment below 4% since the 1960s. That's really good. And frankly, in many ways, we should have been in a recession now, given how hard it is to get inflation down. That's not what happened. This is good. Now, the piece, and you talk about this dissonance, that got me attacked by everyone from MAGA to far left. And frankly, the far left was much more horrible to me, which is, that was a lot of fun.
It's always fun when you get both of the extremes mad at you, right?
Yeah, it's like people are like, you're making up the good news and then you don't care about people. I'm just
right.
like, what?
That's
so,
you.
Yeah, but I'm an economist. I just look at the data. And where this all started is we were looking at these consumer sentiment numbers. So that's where we go out and we ask people, how are you doing financially? Where do you think the economy is going? I used those, really respect those numbers when I was at the Fed. But what started happening is when you ask people, the sentiment looked like the early 1980s, the late 70s. And we're like, no, see, it was worse then, right? So I get it. High inflation, people are going to be angry. But it's like, how do you look around and say it's the 1970s? Mm-hmm. Really, like that just doesn't make sense. Inflation was so much higher, unemployment was high,
right?
And people were wearing bell bottoms. I mean, like, how can you be that angry? And so that was the piece. And I think what got lost is a lot of people, well, there's reasons to be angry. And I'm like, I hear you, there are, but this is like over the top,
right?
And in the sense that for me as an economist, I would normally look at those sentiment numbers and say, we're going over the cliff, right? Normally that really tells us something. And for me, I got to the point where I'm like, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah, so that's a critical piece, Claudia. So you're saying that historically, these numbers have tracked with the economy. So this is sort of an unprecedented point in economic data and sentiment data that's showing this dissonance?
Absolutely. When I started at the Federal Reserve in the summer of 2007, focused on consumers, the people called the recession before the professionals. Mm-hmm. And that sentiment started to turn south before 2008. Not too much before, but when the data still looked great, the macro data. So that was it made me very concerned when these numbers looked so bad at the end of 2021 and then 2022, and then nothing came, but the recession didn't come. And then the next thing I did, and I think this is what really got me in trouble, is I made the case that most Americans are financially better off. I go to surveys where they tell me, do you have a job? How much wealth do you have? What, like all of these aspects that we would think of as financial well-being, inflation adjusted, and they looked good. They looked better than before the pandemic. And that caused lots of concerns. But it's like, look, I'm going to the data and I'm asking people, how do you feel? And then I'm asking people, do you have a job?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not me. And there I was very careful to stay away from the quote unquote macro data as much as I could. These were household surveys.
Right. And so tell us, where does that data come from?
So there's a wide range of sources. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has very good information. They're the go-to for all of the employment, the labor market. The Survey of Consumer Finances was one that's the wealth data. And that one was every 3 years. What they showed was 2022 versus 2023 versus 2019, historic gains in wealth across all demographics, all income groups. I mean, it was just like, wow. And it was the median.
Yeah.
Right. So that means at least half of these people had gains. So that was a really big one that was important in my, like, really, where a lot of people are better off. Not everybody.
Right.
But a lot of people. So, and I think actually, and I probably made the mistake on a podcast of saying, hey, I'm still trying to figure this out. Send me what you think.
Yeah.
I got a lot of emails. Some of them were kind of unpleasant. But one thing that did come out, because I'd made the argument, this isn't economics. This is like, we're blasting bad news and social media is amplifying it. It's politics. It's COVID has just broken us, so it goes everywhere. The one that came to me that was an economic feature that I hadn't thought as much about was this insecurity, right? People saying, yeah, I look better off on paper, but I feel like it could all fall apart.
Right.
And I'm like, well, many of my peers have been telling you for 2 years that we are headed towards a recession. And we've had all of these traumatic events, where people lost jobs suddenly. So I was like, I get that. And that actually is something somewhat different from the 1970s.
Sure.
I still think there's a lot of non-economics in here.
Yeah.
But I was like, no, I think that's one that we should think about. And I'm happy that the consensus now is no longer calling for a recession.
Right.
So we're no longer scaring people.
Right.
Which I think is good.
Well, I can relate to the position that you have been in on this issue. I have made claims about this position with student loans being less unfavorable than many people believe it to be, based on, looking at means and trends and data. And a lot of the criticism that I received at that time was that the data that I was looking at, which are really the main indicators, weren't capturing something. Do you think that's happening here, or is that something that you have received as criticism, that the indicators that we're used to looking at, which are things like the unemployment rate, month-to-month job gains, inflation numbers facing consumers, that those aren't aren't capturing something that people really are feeling?
Anyone who's putting together official statistics or surveys, private data, they're doing God's work at this point. Right? It was so hard during COVID. The surveys just getting to people, right? And some of the adjustments that we'd make about, seasonal patterns and things like this, they're just really hard. And it's actually gotten harder and harder to get people to answer surveys in general. And so that can cause problems with the quality of the data.
Okay.
Now, yeah, and I certainly hear this is a made up number and they cite shadow stats. And I'm like, no, we're not doing that. And no data set is perfect. Right, you're going to want to understand different features. One aspect that comes up, and I think I have interacted with some of your critics about student loans, is everything moves so fast. The reality is individuals who had student loans got a massive amount of relief. Like, that was unprecedented, as did people who were shielded from evictions. And frankly, people who got stimulus checks. Like, it was just unprecedented how much support we did. And there's this aspect of both you had promised, not you, but they had been promised, like, from the administration, we're going to erase these debts.
Right.
Right. So they had this view, like, hopes were, they had all this hope. I'm not sure why we pushed so hard on this hope. And then the rug got pulled out under them.
Yeah.
right? And you had to restart. So there was this aspect of, well, we're angry because we had all this help and you took it away.
Right.
And it's like, well, all of these, and student loans kind of a special case, like these were all meant to be temporary.
Right.
Right. And so you'd rather not have had it, like, so I think there's a little bit of this psychology. And yet the student loan, I just wander in every once in a while to an angry mob. I think that's where you live.
I do,
your
yes.
space. And so
one thing that I think comes from what you just described in the student loan situation is that we kind of moved the bar in terms of people's expectations. And so they now kind of experience the status quo as a loss relative to some expectation. Do you think that might be, contributing to what we're seeing in the dissonance between, consumer sentiment and the economic data?
There's the expectations piece. There's also the relief was so big and lasted so long. People adjusted their lives in ways that make it difficult, right? If you took out some loans to buy more furniture, or did something like you found a way to spend, make some commitments that are more on a regular basis with the money that you're going to have to turn around and start using for student loans. So it creates that tension because you kind of, not just you expected it, you fell into the behavior of,
right,
we're going to, use this for other stuff, which can make sense. I mean, and then I think the other piece, and again, the student loans, they got a lot of grace on this. Many of these relief programs, they just ended. Even if you knew it was coming, it's just kind of this shock of, I had the extra food stamps 1 month and the next month I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The student loans, they have a grace period to kind of move. They're not going to go after people that don't make payments until many months from now. But it's still this kind of jarring for those individuals, like that help is gone. And I debated with Matt Brunig on another podcast on about this, and it was like this expectation writ large that we would kind of have a welfare state.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I push back. I don't think most Americans want a welfare state, but I can see where if you thought like all this was we were just going to support people going forward, somehow it was going to turn into the temporary to the permanent. And so it could just be big picture dashed hopes, not even just your specific program.
Right.
I find that one
that's
a
what I was
little
imagining.
bit hard.
Because I think student loans are bounded by the fact that not everybody has them, not everybody experienced that, but there's a bigger sense in that the government was there to support us and give us resources, right? Which created measurable changes in wealth. And maybe that is a broader expectation about the change in the role of government.
Right. And we had other change, like things that like inflation hadn't happened for quite a while. Right. So that was a shock that maybe just you go into it. The one that I was arguing with Matt Stoller on Twitter last night, which I really shouldn't do late at night, is, the interest rates are so high and people are so angry about the housing. And I said, well, okay, first of all, again, comparing back to the 1970s, like it was worse then. Like Volcker moved up interest rates a lot more and they were a lot higher.
Yeah.
Second of all, most people are not looking to buy a new home.
Mm-hmm.
Affordability is a crisis. We need to help with that. But this is not about the Fed. This is, and then it's like, what? A huge fraction of homeowners, which are a much larger group than like looking to buy, they refinanced in 2020 and early 2021 when we had rock bottom interest rates. So many of these homeowners actually have smaller mortgage payments than they did before. So I'm just like, I don't buy this. He didn't appreciate the response, but everybody's trying to figure this out, and I get it because whatever it is, they're different. Hey, what would be the solution? What should we do?
Yeah.
But it kind of turns out that most of us, and I'm sure I do this too, we gravitate to our hobby horse.
Mm-hmm.
And then like kind of backward, maybe not even intentionally, like we really want X policy. And so we're convinced that people are really mad because they don't have X policy.
Yep.
We have to be a little careful about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that sort of admission is why I enjoy discussing ideas with you, Claudia. So let's take a break now. And I'm speaking with Claudia Sahm, and we'll come back to her after the break. You're listening to Defending Ideas.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. This is Beth Akers, and you're listening to my segment on Defending Enterprise. I'm here with my guest, economist Claudia Sahm, and we're talking about the current dissonance between consumer sentiment and economic data. So, Claudia, we talked a lot about, what the data are telling us. You come across as the unsympathetic economist, which is the role that I usually get to live in. So, welcome to my world. But now the question is, what do we do about it? So, neither you or I are psychologists, who I think would be the ones that we might need to lean on to understand, where this deviation is coming from. But as economists, as people are thinking about optimal policy, what do we do with this information?
Right. One thing I make clear when I get into the discussion, I'm not questioning how people feel, like that they are pessimistic about the future. They feel like, despite the fact that they told me they have a job and all this, that they feel like their finances are worse. Like, I'm very, this is marriage counseling 101. Do not tell people how to feel or question their feelings. So, right. But I want to understand them. And to me, it's, as an economist who, I care about people in the sense that I want to make sure that they have what they need to live a life of dignity and, to do the things that, they really want to do. And for most Americans, that means having some money in the bank, like having a good job. And what I am most concerned about right now is finding ways to protect the gains that we've made, particularly in the labor market.
Yeah.
It's just, I could go on and on about every dimension that we have made some real progress, particularly in bringing groups that have, tended to be more on the margins into jobs and good jobs with wages, with increase. So this has been a very special recovery in that it has lifted a lot of people up, a lot of workers up. So that's good. My main focus is preserve that and run with that.
Yeah.
And many of my columns, I write regularly about once a week at Bloomberg Opinion. I had several columns where here's a problem, or what's been an outstanding problem. A lot of times, say one example was I talked about Black men's labor force participation, right? And talked about in last year, it hit record highs. And there were just been real progress. And this is a group that can really struggle to be in the labor market. I always say, we can't bank on a full employment labor market. There are other things. We see how important that is to these to individuals to have the jobs, have good. So, okay, what are policies we could put in place that would, even if the labor market isn't firing on all cylinders, they'd still be able to get work. And one that it's a higher prevalence among Black men to have felonies, criminal histories, and to really make sure that these programs to help connect them with jobs are even better than they are. So I go through and kind of talk about, I have this rhythm of here's a problem, and then here's 3 possible solutions.
Right.
And many of those fit within how do we bolster that labor market to make sure we keep that going.
Yeah.
So that's a big piece. Inflation's coming down. And I have, with limited success, really talked with members of Congress, with the White House about and written broadly, in various publications about we cannot keep this attitude that if there's inflation, the Fed's got this. A lot of the inflation this time was not driven by demand. Fed Chair Jay Powell did not drill for oil. He did not unload the docks in LA. He didn't take a second job. He didn't give the vaccines out. Those are the things that brought down inflation.
Yeah. Well, let's leave that point aside because it may be one that I'm not sure we necessarily agree on. But the question I had was that, of course, the facts are the inflation has come down, right? And so in terms of the consumer side of the problem, why aren't people feeling that, right? And there's this, on the feeling side, we don't want to reject people's feelings as being inappropriate or incorrect. But it is curious to me to try to understand more where those feelings are coming from. And I have to wonder if the evolution or the innovation in media, which I know you're intimately involved with new media, whether that's changing the way that people interpret information. I wondered if you had a take on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will say we're more in agreement than I think, on inflation. It's a complex problem. Yeah. There's absolutely demand. There's lots of things going on under the hood.
Right.
It's just, I think inflation's got some momentum now, and the Fed going hard Like that can put the labor market at risk. So that's all I
Yeah.
wanted to, that's the only reason I was and I do think we have to think about structural, like how do we just make the economy more resilient?
Sure.
So that, anyways, but yes, we don't need to do the inflation debate.
We'll save that one for another episode.
Yeah, that'll
Claudia.
be another time.
I'll have to do some more homework before that one.
Yeah, no. On the social media. Okay, so I do have a piece. I have a piece at Bloomberg on this as I started to get into this, like what is going on with this gloominess. And it's the mechanisms I talk about. So there are legitimately bad things happening in the world, like high inflation. And then like with news media, traditional news media, if it bleeds, it leads. Right. So we have all this bad news. It's going to get into the, just the regular news as more bad. Okay, this is nothing new. And then what we have, a technology that's much more recent, and certainly wasn't in the 70s, early 80s, is we have social media that will take that and just amplify it. So it moves faster, it moves wider.
Yeah.
Another thing I had read about was it also becomes more personal. Like if you're watching someone on YouTube or a person it feels like there's more of a connection than if it's just someone on TV talking. And so that makes sense. And then the piece, and there's a lot of research that shows, on Twitter, bad news gets amplified more. This is very clear, the pattern. And the finding I found most interesting, I think the White House, when I was talking to them, found most interesting, I said, more good news doesn't cut it. You have to have less bad news.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's the bad news that we gravitate towards.
Right.
And that's the hard one. I mean, we need reality to be less bad. I mean, inflation's coming down. A big one at the end of the year, the stock market went up.
Mm-hmm.
And those sentiment numbers really, there was a good bounce in December, and gas prices are down. So but this is the thing, if there's less bad things happening in the world, there's less bleeding to lead, right? Like even if they ignore it, at least they're not doing the bad news. And then it's a really tricky subject. Like you can't tell people to feel better. I do think there's some infighting, and I talked about being attacked from the far left, and it's like there ought to be a way to get left of center to hold hands, right? Like, or just stop like being the source of the angry. So that's one way I feel like, Democrats could try to lower the bad news, but I mean, that's tricky too. I mean, as like, just in general, like people have their positions and they're angry and, but social media has given an opportunity to just amplify it in a way that we haven't seen before. And you're not shutting down social media.
Yeah.
So this is a reality.
Do you think it's fair to say that people are collecting, data in the same way for themselves, but maybe have a different way of processing that data and turning it into their overall sentiment feeling?
Yes. The Michigan survey, which is one of the big surveys for consumer sentiment, in addition to asking people these questions that show up in the big index and how do you feel about your finances, they also ask them, have you heard good news about the economy or bad news? So they ask them about like the economic news they're hearing, and they follow up, well, what kind of news was that? Right, so you get the inflation, the bad news. That is one that like legitimately and much longer has looked like the late 70s, early 80s. Mm-hmm. So it's clear. I mean, people are that's what they're hearing, and they're hearing a lot of it. And they're basically hearing like nothing good about the labor market. Like that's the other thing that's striking, because we have this labor market that is so good relative to like the you got to go way, way back. But people, it's just like,
they're not feeling it,
not hearing it. And if you don't hear it and internalize it, then it's probably not going to come across in some of these questions, particularly ones that are about the economy or in general.
Yeah, because the ability for consumers to really feel the market is really pretty limited. You have to be a job changer or somebody who has like a lot of data on what opportunities are available to you, which is a pretty small share of, the population. So really these attitudes are coming from what they're hearing.
Yeah. And there's certain types of prices people get really concerned about when they're high. So these like food has been one reason, because gasoline prices had come down. So they'd been angry about that. And that's less of a, in the focus. So food. And as an example with the internet, there's like this genre that has come up of people going out to a restaurant, buying outrageous food combinations, and then like putting the receipt and like, oh, look at how much I paid. And a bunch of people were like, why in the world did you buy that? That's like a disgusting combination at a bar. Like, but then they put it on social media.
Yeah.
So we have like hamburger tweets and we have bar tweets. And, and so to me, that was a case where there's a real thing happening with food prices.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like, it just turns into this meme.
Right.
That again, amplifies it. So it's like
the
reality
outrage economy.
It's like, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
A little frightening, but it is interesting to see how, because as you said, most people are not going to sit like I do at 8:30 a.m. on jobs day and like refresh on the Bureau of Labor Statistics site. They're much more likely to see that hamburger tweet.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a...
That's right. All right, Claudia, let me ask you one more question before we wrap up here. Now, I don't know about you, but as an economist, I usually like to just blame the politicians for things that are going wrong. So is there an argument to be made here that, this dissonance is being driven by the rhetoric coming out of Washington, D.C., and that, we should be looking at politicians to change the way that they're talking?
I hate politics. I mean, the longer I've been outside of the Fed and working on fiscal policy, the more frustrated I've become.
Yeah.
I was on a panel. There were a lot of Democratic lawmakers, and the panel was telling our story. And I was supposed to help them, spin the narrative of the inflation. So this was early last year.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm not telling your story. I could do it. I'm not telling your story. This was right after Putin invaded Ukraine. I said, you need to move heaven and earth to get gas prices down. Like, I don't care what you say, like, and I know you don't want to do the oil production. I know you don't, because long term, I love the planet too, but it's like Americans cannot adjust to that and they will be so angry at you.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, again, the politics. So they took the actions, opened up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, wrote contracts with oil producers that had a bottom price to encourage, to refill the reserve so they wouldn't get burned. Oil production in the United States is higher than at any point. And do you think the Democrats are running around taking the victory lap? See, we did all this stuff. We brought gas prices down. No, because they don't want to say they did all of these things. But to me, that was what was important at the moment. Like, you have to do something. Mm-hmm. You cannot just tell people it's okay. It's going to get better. And there were so many levers Congress could have pulled. Mm-hmm. And we're walking out of this with the same view out of the Fed's inflation. And I was like, we're going to do this all over again if you don't wake up. So to me, it's been, what frustrates me with lawmakers is they want to lean on the messaging.
Yeah.
And I get it, nothing's going to pass, but at least you could come out and tell people, we've got a plan. If we could just get it through, we've got a plan. Instead of they come out and like, oh, it's not so bad. It's just like, that's not going to work.
Right.
But again, I don't know. My experiences with the politics have not been pleasant, but I feel for them. These are elected officials. They're there for a reason.
Yeah.
But it's, you're not talking people out of this.
Yep.
Right.
I agree with you. Claudia, thank you so much for telling us your story, not anyone else's story. We appreciate your time with us today.
Right. Thank you.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nick Dunn, and you just heard a great conversation between our regular feature contributor, Beth Akers, and Claudia Sahm, talking about the question of, are you better off today, economically speaking, than you were 4 years ago? Beth, to round out the conversation, I want to kind of do some follow-up with you. Mm-hmm. A couple of things that you and Claudia talked about stood out to me. First, just kind of recapture for our listeners, really the big takeaway from your discussion with Claudia was there's sort of a conflict between two data sets that are trying to describe how the economy is doing today.
Right.
Capture that again for us to make sure we remember what that conflict or dissonance is.
Yeah, so if we look pretty narrowly at the traditional economic data, we would think that people are doing better today than they were 4 years ago. Claudia cites in some of her work that individual wealth has increased. We know that the unemployment rate has remained really low at historically low levels, and the inflation that was really bothersome for a lot of time has really come back down to very reasonable levels. So those are indicators that suggest that people are doing quite well today, and in fact better than they were 4 years ago. And if you ask them, they'll tell you they're doing much worse.
So, and you got into it with Claudia a little bit, but I want to ask, how does that get reconciled? Because I could just assume or imagine that folks listening might say, well, it's one thing for economists to say, well, this is what the data says. But if that's not really manifesting in the way people are really feeling in their day-to-day lives, I want to see if there's a way to understand better that conflict or that dissonance. And maybe one way to put it for simplicity's sake is those things you talked about, the job growth rate, the unemployment rate, GDP, and there's a lot of other economic metrics that folks look at to determine the health of the economy. Yeah. If we look at those as kind of economic data, but then think about what I would maybe call kitchen table data. So the kind of conversations average families are having around the kitchen table at home in terms of how are we doing? Are we going to make rent this month? Are we going to be able to afford soccer lessons this month? I mean, things like that. Are those two things just on different planets? Because if you're a regular middle-class family, you don't actually care what the job growth rate is. You care if you have a job and if you can pay your bills.
Right.
Right?
I tend to think that people actually are affected in a very real way by the indicators that economists typically use. And what I worry about is a lot of the sentiment that happens at the table is influenced by things that are far beyond what are just economic realities. So we've got, had huge innovations in the way that the media covers the economy or covers everything, really. And so people are getting information about the economy, about politics in a totally different way and maybe a more dramatic way, I might argue. And so as an economist, I'm much more worried about the numbers that are in those traditional metrics. I think we should care about how people are feeling, but I don't necessarily think we should be crafting economic or any sort of policy based on those reactions. I'm not really convinced that they're experiencing something that is worth us responding to beyond trying to understand where that sentiment is coming from right now.
So here's, just by way of, I'll characterize this as a pushback with a huge caveat that I'm not an economist, so I'm super out of my depth here. But from that and the conversation with you and Claudia, you mentioned a couple times that inflation has come down.
Yeah.
And just to clarify for our listeners that inflation is just the rate of increase in prices.
That's right.
And so if inflation is lower now than it was before, prices are still inflating, right? So if I'm a middle-class family and I look at, you go to the grocery store and you see that frozen pizzas are twice as expensive now than they were a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And every time you go to the store, I say, they're twice as expensive. If that price keeps on going up, but it's increasing a little more slowly than it used to, can't we kind of assume that consumers are not going to say, yay, inflation's coming down, if that doesn't mean that prices are coming down? Prices are still high and increasing. They're just increasing a little more slowly. How do we make sense of that for folks?
So I think people are used to judging inflation and prices by the sticker that's on the shelf in the grocery store, which is very reasonable. Economists think about inflation as the rate of increase in price because we tend to believe that the prices should be steadily increasing over time. The Federal Reserve targets that inflation is about 2%. So we're anticipating this constant rate of increase, but the rate of increase that we're looking for is low enough that people kind of don't notice it, right? We know that prices go up over time, but when inflation got so high that people were noticing it, that's when a lot of consumer attention was drawn to that issue. So consumers won't see prices come down. If prices come down, we're actually in a heap of economic trouble. That would be terrible for the economy. So when we look at things like, are people better off today than they were 4 years ago, we have to take into account those higher prices. But what we see is that wages and wealth have increased sufficiently to offset those increases in price. So consumers won't see that. And it may be that just the psychology of that people aren't thinking about inflation in the same way that economists are, is affecting the way that they feel, and that we've made such a big deal about inflation in the news that people, are feeling it and are feeling upset about it. So while we're succeeding in reining inflation, we're maybe not succeeding in reining in people's concern about inflation.
You mentioned one thing I want to pinpoint. You mentioned that if prices were to suddenly come down, I don't think you used the word suddenly, but if prices were to come down, that would create some challenges.
Right.
Help us understand that. Why is that the case? Again, thinking from your average consumer, your average middle-class home, if they go to the grocery store tomorrow and say, wow, our grocery bill is actually, we bought the same stuff, it's 30% less than it used to be. Our gas is cheaper, our housing costs are cheaper, whatever the main drivers are that they're concerned about. If things are cheaper, why would that not be viewed as a good thing?
This is a great question because economists usually have complicated answers, but this is a simple one. It's that if you know that prices are going down and they're going down quickly, why would you buy anything today when you could wait until tomorrow to buy it at a cheaper price? The problem is that nobody is spending today, and we sort of cripple the economy by the anticipation of prices going down in the future.
I mean, but I still need a gallon of milk today, right? I mean, is it those kinds of things, that things I need to buy anyway that I don't have as much flexibility?
So basically, we need consumers demanding things, to use the language of economics, right? And if we had downward inflation, prices going down, it would be a huge shock to demand. So yes, there are things you'd have to buy today, but there's a lot of things that you would put off buying today, just like people put off buying things during recessions, and that compounds the problem of a recession. If prices are going down in the future, people are going to hold off on purchases that they're able to hold off on. That is a huge negative shock to demand, which really can induce an immediate recession.
So looking at this conversation in the context, again, we said at the beginning of it's an election year, there's going to be debates about this. A lot of folks are going to be asking themselves, am I better off now than I was in the past? What's one key takeaway that our listeners should have in their minds, either about this debate of the economic data versus consumer sentiment or inflation? What's something that you think would just really help them be able to assess what they hear about these economic debates? So as they're making consumer decisions and decisions as voters, what's something really important for them to remember from this conversation?
I think people should pay attention to the data to get a sense of where the economy is outside of their own bubble. We know that when we only look to the experiences in our immediate communities, they're not representative. So I think the economic data can really help people understand. And if you go there, you see that things are, in fact, a lot better. Now, a debate that they're going to see as we go into this election is something that I touched on in the conversation with Claudia, and that was about what drove the inflation that we did see over recent years. And so the political division on this issue is what Claudia talked about, which was that people on the left of this argument tend to believe that things like the war in Russia and Ukraine, supply chain disruptions during COVID, and other factors were what drove the inflation. And so it was not as a result of the fiscal policy that we had at the beginning of the Biden administration. And they even go so far as to argue that the Fed intervention was not necessary. On the right side of the argument, people are more keen to the idea that it was the vastly expansionary fiscal policy, that was the spending at the beginning of the Biden administration that was really above and beyond what was necessary given the conditions that drove us into that inflationary environment. So it's a complicated argument, but it's one that you're going to see both sides taking credit for the win, which is that we brought inflation back into control. So I'd just say be a wary consumer of anything that politicians are telling you about inflation.
Well, Beth, we'll have you back on frequently as your regular contributor with these Defending Enterprise segments, especially if things pop in the coming year that are going to be really relevant to this question of economic data. What's the best way to make sense of these arguments? Again, so our listeners can be informed as they're making decisions about their own lives. So thank you again for joining us. Thanks for your conversation with Claudia. It's something that I think is very important for listeners to develop a deeper understanding about, because free enterprise as a system is so important to the functioning of the country.
Absolutely.
So thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Well, that will about do it for us here at Defending Ideas. Thanks again to Beth for our Defending Enterprise segment. If you liked this episode and what you heard today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to the podcast, access short clips from this and previous episodes that you can use on social media and share with friends and family in your conversations about these issues. That's defendingideas.org. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to the Sutherland YouTube channel to catch all of these episodes when they're released each week. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nick Dunn. We'll see you next time.